Hello everyone, and thank you for tuning into our channel once again. We're going to be in the Gospel of John, and we're in John chapter 11. And this, of course, is just an awesome chapter because of what Jesus did to prove his divinity, that he indeed is the Son of God. Now, let's set up what we're going to be talking about, because there in verse 1, we notice that it says that there was a certain man, a man by the name of Lazarus, who had become sick. Now, let's find out a little bit more about him. Notice it says, now a certain man was sick, named Lazarus, of Bethany, the town of Mary and Martha, his sisters. And so here we have Mary and Martha, our sisters, and Lazarus is the brother of these two sisters. Okay? And then we go on in verse 2, we get a little bit more information as to who this Mary was, because it says in verse 2, it was that Mary which anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. And so this gives us a little bit of information as to which Mary we are talking about. But it's very interesting to note the relationship that Jesus had with Mary and Martha and also Lazarus. Matter of fact, when he would come to this area in Bethany, he would come to their house, and there he would stay with them. And you might recall on one occasion that Jesus was teaching in their house, and that Mary was sitting at the feet of Jesus listening. Martha was busy doing everything else, and she complained to the Lord about Mary. And of course, he told Martha that she was really troubled by a lot of things, but that Mary was the one who chose the better of all those things. And it's better to listen to Jesus than anything else, because all those other things will take care of themselves in their own time. Now in verse 3, as we continue, notice that it says, therefore his sisters sent unto him, that is unto Jesus, saying, Lord, behold, he whom thou lovest is sick. And so they bring word to Jesus, telling Jesus that Lazarus is sick. And, this, I'm sure, in a lot of situations would have been troubling, and yet we find that Jesus was not troubled by this sickness. Matter of fact, we find that Jesus even made this particular statement. And of course, this statement needs some explanation, but we will explain, because Jesus said in verse 4, when Jesus heard that, he said, this sickness is not unto death, but for the glory of God, that the Son of God might be glorified thereby. Well, Jesus, what do you mean? Did not Lazarus die? Well, yeah, he did. And so is this a contradiction? No, it's not a contradiction. But what Jesus is saying is this, that even though Lazarus will die, he will not remain dead. He's going to be raised from the dead. And through the resurrection of Lazarus, would Jesus be able to prove the fact that he is the Son of God? And so Jesus pretty much said, don't worry about it. It's all going to be okay, because this is going to be done to the glory of God. In verse 5, we continue, and it says, now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. Now, it's very important to understand that Jesus had very close relationships unto some individuals, and this family was one of those families that I guess you could say was kind of like in his inner circle. Did Jesus love everyone? Yes, he does, and he did. But we find here in this context how close Jesus was to this family. Notice in verse 6 it continues, and it says, when he had heard therefore that he was sick, that is, when Lazarus was sick, he abode 2 days still in the same place where he was. Now, this might be surprising to a lot of people, and they say, well, wait a minute, did not they send word that Lazarus was sick? Yes. Why did Jesus stay in the place where he was for 2 days? Why didn't he just up and leave and go and be by the side of his friend? Why didn't he do that? Well, as we said, it goes back to what we talked about there in verse 4. He's allowing things to take place naturally, so he, of course, would be able to raise Lazarus from the dead. And I do apologize, we've got a weed eater going on outside, but we're going to continue right along. And so now we find that it says in verse 7, then after that said he to his disciples, let us go into Judea again. And so now Jesus is ready to go. He is going to go to that family, and he's going to take care of business. He's going to do what he needs to do. Now, in verse 8, his disciples said unto him, Master, the Jews of late sought to stone thee, and goest thou thither again? Remember, Jesus had withdrawn himself from Judea because of the Jews, the Pharisees, wanting to stone him to death. And yet we see now that Jesus was going back. And so his disciples are questioning as to whether or not that's a good idea. Well, of course, Jesus was not worried about the Jews. He knew his time was not at hand. He knew that he would be able to go and help his friend and that wonderful family. And so you'll find that Jesus answers them there in verse 9 by saying, Are there not 12 hours in the day? And of course, he's just talking about the period of daylight. He said, Is there not 12 hours in a day, or in the day? He says, If any man walk in the day, he stumbleth not, because he seeth the light that is in this world. And so what is he saying? Well, he's going to make a spiritual application here. But if a man walk in the night, he stumbleth, because there is no light in him. These things said he, and after that he saith unto them, Our friend Lazarus sleepeth, but I go that I may awake him out of sleep. Now, notice how the Lord describes the fact that Lazarus has died. He just says he's just sleeping. He's just sleeping. What do you do when somebody's asleep? Well, you go in there and you wake them up. Well, here we find that Lazarus is dead. And yet Jesus acts like, well, it's just as easy as going and waking somebody up from the sleep. And so that's what he was going to go and do. And so the point being is, those Jews who were trying to kill him, they were not walking in the light, they were walking in the night. They, of course, were stumbling. They found Jesus as being that stone of stumbling. And yet there were those individuals there too that believed in Jesus, those individuals there who were coming around and understanding who he was and believing in him. And so these individuals were coming into the light. But then notice once again, he says, Our friend Lazarus is asleep, but I go to him. And his disciples said there in verse 12, Well, Lord, if he's sleeping, he shall do well. In other words, he's going to be able to recover. Verse 13, Howbeit Jesus spake of his death, but they thought that he had spoken of taking of rest in sleep. That's not what Jesus was talking about. And of course, there in verse 14, Jesus goes on and he says what? He tells them plainly, Lazarus is dead. And this is another surprising statement, because you'll find here in verse 15, Jesus said, And I am glad for your sake that I was not there. What? Lord, you were glad that you weren't there? Well, he was glad for their sake. Well, what do you mean by that? Well, notice he goes on. He says, To the intent ye may believe, nevertheless, let us go unto him. And so Jesus said, I'm glad that I didn't go earlier. I'm glad that he has passed away. I'm glad because of what it's going to do for you. It is going to help you to believe, even more than what they did. And not only them, but remember that after Jesus raised Lazarus from the dead, people would come to see Lazarus because Lazarus was now alive. And that, of course, spiked their interest in knowing more and more and more about Jesus. Well, we're going to stop here and we'll pick up tomorrow with verse 16 and talk a little bit about Thomas and what he said, and then what Jesus did when he finally got there to Bethany. And we do appreciate y'all tuning in with us today, and we just hope and pray that you have a wonderful day.